Okay, welcome back. This is screencast number 2 for week 4, where we're talking about writing a research proposal. So I think we left off talking about the methodology, and so saying that part of the methodology you have to describe the research participants, the design, the apparatus or instruments, and the procedure. So the research methods that you decide that you're going to employ can utilize either a singular approach, such as like a descriptive study, exploratory study, which is kind of what exploratory is, what we did with the writing, predictive, explanatory, or action, or it can be a combination of those approaches. So all kind of depends on the choice of the research and the aim or the reason for taking on the research. But whatever method you're going to utilize, it's useful to describe it or required to describe it in the method or design section. So it's really important, particularly when you're putting these, if you're putting it out for publication or you're putting it in front of a review board, that you demonstrate in your method section that you have a sound methodology. So you understand the different ways that you can design studies in your field. You show how you plan to research the problem, through what channels you're going to research that problem. If you're using a design that sometimes tends to evolve and then doesn't necessarily lend itself to pre-planning, like if you're doing an ethnography, an interpretive, or a case study, that can be harder because the researcher has to satisfy the panel or whoever the review board is that they're capable of carrying out research that has kind of a more free-flowing design. So these people sometimes think that doing an ethnography or doing a case study is an easier approach to research, when actually it's much more difficult, because it's not just about doing the research. Then you need to prove that you know how to qualify that data, so that you know what to do with the data once you get it. So we'll talk a lot more about this over the course of the semester, but the methods that you choose can basically be divided into quantitative studies or qualitative studies. So qualitative would be like interviews, questionnaires, these ethnographies, case studies. Quantitative is when you have like actual statistics and numbers that you can crunch. So you have like real hard data, and then that's when you need to know all the statistics to make sense of that data, which is a real good time. I can trust me on that one. Some research projects, though, they necessitate qualitative and quantitative. It could be more one than the other, or sometimes it's kind of an equal mix of the two. So the type of data that a researcher expects to collect should be detailed here, and you need to describe what kind of statistical tools or data analysis you're going to use to interpret this data. So if you are using more quantitative, like hard numbers, there's accepted methodologies for interpreting that data. So you would be looking at, crunching it through certain programs that people in your field would be familiar with. And then if you're doing more qualitative, you would talk about things like coding your observations or coding your interviews, where you're highlighting and looking for particular, trends, or wanting to group the information somehow. So this is, like I said, every proposal will have a methodology section. Kind of how you put it together might be a little bit different depending on what they're asking for. But it's important to remember that the methodology isn't always set in stone, and so sometimes you find that you need to review the method that you chose as you start to gather new information as your research progresses. So this is like one of the things that we found in the writing study was we kind of had expectations about what we were going to see, and then when we didn't see those things, we actually we went back and changed it a little, because we looked at our notes and our observations differently, because we found out that teacher beliefs actually were a much bigger part of our whole question than we originally thought. And so we had to kind of go in and into our methodology section and talk about how we had to recode our data to look at teacher beliefs. So sometimes that methodology can be kind of a looped process rather than this linear process where you kind of go back and you revise it. If you make huge changes, you have to bring it back to the review board or the panel, whoever was looking at your research. So another thing to consider here is the ethical considerations. So that's when you're getting into participants and who's going to be there. So you have to have this written description of the individuals that will participate in the research study and how they're going to be recruited. Things that you have to talk about are characteristics like their age or their gender, what the inclusion or the exclusion criteria is going to be, and any inducements for participation. So sometimes when you want to do a study, you can offer money or things. So that has to be part of your methodology section, saying that we're going to give all participating teachers a $10 gift card to Starbucks, which is one of the things that we do as an incentive for participating. When I was a teacher, I actually participated in a very large study where every time I turned my data in, I got a $25 check from them. So just as an extra incentive, because it is often quite difficult, particularly when you're relying on individuals recording their own behavior or individuals submitting items to you or letting them in your classroom to actually get that stuff back or to be allowed in. So sometimes you need a little bit of inducement, as we call it, or bribery. Do this for me and I'll do this for you, right? So it's when you're talking about participants, so obviously most of the research that we do in our field deals with children, so it can be real difficult to get this stuff passed through the IRB because they're minors, and if you want to record or you want to take pictures or even just to verbally record them, to look at their IEPs or to look in their files or to look at their test scores, none of this is public information, so when you're looking at it at individual students, so this can be difficult. So you need to think about kind of what are the practices relating to ethics in your particular field. So each university or institution also has their own ethical standards, so you need to be aware of those as well. So it's a real important piece of the methodology section is who's going to be in it and how are they going to be treated, what are you going to do to them. In our field, it's not so much life or death, it's more about privacy in education, and so are you violating privacy, making people uncomfortable, can you leave any lasting psychological harm. Those types of things are important in our field. So, and then of course where it's going to be located, where you're going to actually do these studies. Ours are generally off-site. So then, like we said before, you want to talk about the design. So that presents the plan or the strategy that you're going to use to investigate the questions. If you have a really complicated design, you include a separate design section. Otherwise, it just goes in the procedure part. So things that you want to include are the type of design layout, the variables being studied, description of how the variables are going to be combined. So this changes depending on if you're doing a qualitative or quantitative study, kind of how you talk about variables. And that's part of like who's included and who's excluded and like why you're picking this particular group. And then you kind of have to have a reason for it, right? So why are you using these? And in general, kind of how is your study going to be laid out? And then points of measurement and manipulation. So, when are you going to what are you going to measure? What pieces are you going to measure? When, kind of how often? That's all part of your design section. So then there's, part of the design is obviously collecting that data. So you have to have an apparatus or an instrument for collecting that data. And so kind of that general information to include is a general description of that apparatus or the instrument. Often you use a tool that has already been used before. So if you think about in 516 right now, you're going to use the, if you're in my in-person class or you're taking it with Professor Brandon, you're using that motivation to read profile this week, right? So if you were going to do a large-scale study or you were going to write a research proposal in which you wanted to use the MRP as your apparatus, you would need to include a description of that tool, and that's a well-known tool if you're studying motivation in reading. It's been thoroughly vetted and used, and you would have to explain in this section what it measures, what it's used for, and then the reliability and the validity of that tool. So it's really nice when you're actually doing a study to find a tool that somebody has already used, because that data will already be there. It is very difficult to make your own tool. It's kind of like a two-step process. And if you're going to make your own survey or a protocol, and then you want to statistically analyze it, so you want to get hard data and numbers, and you're making your own survey, it's really challenging because you have to go out, you have to pilot it. Your measures of reliability and validity aren't going to be that strong unless you can go out and you can get a huge sample. So I know, like, when you do your dissertation, if you ever go that far, they really don't want to see anything less than 100 participants if you're doing a quantitative study. So it can be really difficult to get that. And if you're going to then make your own instrument in order to get internal reliability and validity data, you want to pilot it too, because if you go out and you give it to 100 participants and then you get that data back and it turns out that it has no internal reliability or validity, you needed to make changes to it, and you don't want to find that out at the end. So you have to go out, you have to pilot your instrument, get all that data back, make any necessary changes, pilot it again. So it's really valuable, or really a good idea, to just find an instrument or an apparatus that's already out there, that somebody's already used, that's well known in the field. It's less of a red flag than creating your own. So, or what you do sometimes, which I've done, is I take somebody else's work and I just change things that aren't significant. So I did a study on teacher efficacy. So the teacher efficacy scale, the TES, put out by Dembo, is very well known and has been used thousands of times in different studies. So I just took certain words out and put different words in, but they weren't words that changed the meaning of the sentence. They were words that made it relevant to my study. So whereas they were looking at teacher efficacy in general, I was looking at teacher efficacy for using a particular program, and so I just put the name of the program in every question. And so it doesn't really change the reliability and the validity, but it makes it more relevant to my study. So you also have to include, why, I don't like this animation I did, why the instruments or the apparatus are used, and then if it's one that already exists out there, kind of where you can find that. And so, whose study was it? Where did it come from? So in your procedure, after into the next section, you describe how that study is going to be executed. So it will talk about the design if you don't have the design in a separate design section. A lot of times you just put the design with the procedure because they're kind of hard to tease out. So like we said, if it's not a very complicated study, you just, in the procedure, your design is in this section. And then it's a detailed step-by-step description of how the study is going to be carried. I did it again, I'm sorry. Of how it's going to be carried out. So this is really, pretty simple, but it needs to be logical. It needs to, follow a particular order. It needs to, the people reading it need to really be able to make sense of what you're doing in this section. So this is an important part of your paper. It's also the part that kind of really explains how you're trying to address that gap or answer that question. And then you have to have a data analysis section. So your data analysis is the description of what you're going to do once you get that data back. So once you get those surveys back, once you get those questionnaires back, like I said, if it's the quantitative study, what kind of statistical analysis are you going to do? If it's qualitative, there's no one way or right way to analyze the data, but there's kind of generally accepted practices. And like I said, a lot of those involve coding because you're looking for relationships, patterns, trends in your data, or a mixed study. And so an example of that was in your chapter on table 19.8, where you would be doing both of those things. And so it looks like I am going to run out of time again, so we will talk about abstract on the next screencast.